Terrific. So welcome to everybody. My name is Jeff Goodman with American Purpose. We'll have other colleagues join us in the next minutes, but let's keep everybody on time and our guest of honor included. Welcome, Jonathan Chait. It's great to see you and have you with us from your busy professional, family, and personal life. Thanks for your time in advance. Jonathan is known to everybody on this Zoom gallery and call. He is a writer for New York Magazine. He's been a writer and been affiliated with closely the New Republic in the past, American Prospect, has written and writes for the LA Times, and he's good, and he's smart, and he's prolific. I got in touch with Jonathan after a July 21st piece he wrote that had as its departure point Cuba, but was about more than Cuba. It was about debates and conflict within the American left between liberalism and, well, left-wing authoritarianism. And I thought it would be fabulous to have him here to talk about the piece, the issues, the developments in that space. And I want to go to the article in just a moment. If you haven't read it, Michelle has put it in chat, new fine piece. Jonathan, if I may, before we get to the piece and your interviews and research and writing, you write, no surprise to anybody on this Zoom, you write from the point of view of, I would say, a convinced liberal. You don't show much fondness for left-wing authoritarianism. May I ask you the personal, professional question? How did you come to these convictions? Was it family, parents' upbringing? Was it experience in life here or in another country? Was it reading and research and analysis? Because you write this piece from a point of view, which is not new to us, but it's analytical, it's sharp, but it projects a certain set of principles. How so, if you could say?
I think what you're also saying is that it's a view that is connected to an intellectual tradition that is identified with an older generation, or even two generations older than me, right? I'm 49 years old, and in this piece especially, I write about the tradition of the Cold War liberals, which is not something that people talk about very much today, except in terms of derision. So part of what I wanted to do in this piece was to defend this intellectual tradition. But to answer your question more directly, I studied a lot of political theory in college and thought a lot about the connections between ideology and actions. And maybe this was somewhat idiosyncratic to the professors I had and the materials I had when I was as an undergrad. But I had a very clear delineation between liberalism and the left. I also took several classes on communist countries. I took Soviet history. I took a history of China under communism. So I had a pretty clear understanding of the connection between communist theory and practice. And so between those areas, the studying the history and studying the political theory, I never had much use for this habit you sometimes see on the left of attributing the failings of communism to the personal faults of the leaders. Well, you know, it was the Soviet Revolution was fine, but it was hijacked by Stalin, or maybe it was hijacked by Lenin somewhere along the line. I think it proceeded pretty directly from the ideological premises of Marxism-Leninism. I thought people had a pretty clear idea of what they were going to do with the revolution once they undertook it, or at least the Bolsheviks did. So that was the worldview I had starting in college. And for most of the beginning of my career, I didn't have much use for those ideas because the left was flat on its back in American politics. I could go looking around for places of people on the authoritarian left to disagree with, but they weren't very easy to find, and they didn't have much power. They weren't doing much. And there's been, there's been a revival. It's still a marginal tendency, but it's a louder tendency. There's been a revival. So I feel like the last 5 or 10 years has really given me a chance to revive that thinking I arrived at an early age.
So thank you very much. And that gives us a good segue to dig into your piece. You start by quoting President Biden, who has said that communism as a system has failed, and universally so. And you say in your piece, but if you look at the left side of our politics, not so fast. There were debates during the Cold War that haven't disappeared. And as you just suggested, 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there's some vibrancy in some of these quarters. Can you tell us a little bit about where and what and why?
Yeah, you notice it most frequently, or at least I do, on social media, which has a very disproportionately loud presence of extremists of all kinds. Right? You can find, if you go on Twitter, a lot of people are shocked because it feels like it's I once said it's like every day is the 1932 German elections. There are Nazis and communists everywhere, which is not reflective of the American polity as a whole, but they're disproportionately concentrated. But it has given the far left more voice in American life. So you do come into contact with these ideas, these either pro-communist ideas or much more commonly anti-communist ideas. So I think you can really trace back to these debates of the early Cold War period, the fault lines in the left that really come back to life through this revival of the far left. And in my piece that you referred that interested you, there were 3 specific texts from the left that I decided to engage with that I thought really articulated the left-wing anti-communist view. One was a book by John Nichols that appeared a couple years ago that I reviewed for New York, but wanted to write about again. The second was an op-ed in the New York Times, and the third was a piece in Dissent. And they were all thematically similar. They were all basically arguing that Cold War liberalism was a failed ideology. And they were making a case against mainstream liberalism and saying that mainstream liberalism of today, the sort of mainstream Democratic Party liberalism, Obama, Biden liberalism, was a failed ideology because it derived from Cold War liberalism. And so what I argue is that, yes, it does derive from Cold War liberalism, but I don't think it's a failed ideology. I think it's a successful ideology for that reason. And I tried to lay out my alternate view of the case.
So one of the pieces that you just mentioned in Dissent indeed talks about Cold War liberalism as today, I think the expression in the piece is a zombie ideology.
Yeah.
What are liberalism's failings from the vantage point of the left? And how is it that we networks, certain groups of public intellectuals and writers have concluded that its failure is complete? It's a dead end. It's over. Not failings where reform is possible, but it's over.
That's a good question. I feel like communists always tried to depict liberalism as just a weaker, paler, less effective version of their own ideology. Right? Communists used to say that they were just liberals in a hurry. So, which meant liberals were just slower, less effective communists, more or less. That's one strand of the critique that you can still see. I think a second strand is a deep discomfort you have on the left with a definition of authoritarianism that encompasses both the left and the right. And so positioning itself between these two ideologies, not in the center of American politics, because liberals are on the left of center of American politics, but still as an abstract ideology between these two forms of authoritarianism, and recognizing that they can both crop up on the left and the right. You don't have to believe that they have equal power and force in American life. I think most liberals like me would say the illiberal authoritarian right is much bigger, much more powerful and more dangerous, but the illiberal authoritarian left still exists. And that formulation of seeing authoritarianism on both sides is very alienating to many people on the left.
So I want to come back to that in a moment, Jonathan, the illiberal liberalism and the illiberal right, but let's hold that for a moment. When I read the piece and I read the work that you cite in your piece, a lot of the critique and argumentation from left-wing authoritarians or those who sympathize with that group or community, it strikes me as very wooden and binary. Are you for the security state, or are you for institutions aimed at economic redistribution? Are you for clinging to elite education? Are you for the expansion of public education? Is this a thing, a phenomenon, a mark of left-wing authoritarianism? Or is this part of the larger zeitgeist where everything has to fit into a neat box and we're binary and either X is a disaster or just the opposite?
I think that's just a common tactic of anyone on the political extremes to always want to define any question in binary terms, because you realize at some level you have this group of people who are in the middle. But you want to deny them the opportunity to be in the middle. You want to bring them to your side. So you say, if you're not with us, you're with the other side. You want to define that middle position out of existence to force everyone in the middle who's closer to you all the way over to your side so that you can gain control over the definition of your own side's ideology and not have this perhaps more subtle, more measured or more moderate alternative that you have to compete with.
Thank you. I want to go back now to what you said and what you wrote in your piece, that illiberal liberalism is an issue and a problem, but pales in comparison to the illiberal right. Can you say more about that?
Yeah.
How do you judge it? How do you assess it? How do you measure these things? How is it that you've come to that conclusion?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say the illiberal left, not illiberal liberalism, because illiberal liberalism is a contradiction in terms. You can't be an illiberal liberal. You've negated what you are. If you're illiberal, you could be on the left and illiberal. You're an illiberal leftist, or maybe an illiberal progressive. But I don't want to quibble about terms. But I guess maybe what I'm getting at is some deeper disagreement here. But let me put it this way: there are illiberal currents on the left that take different kinds of forms, but I don't feel like they have a real foothold in the Democratic Party. Barack Obama has repeatedly denounced political correctness, cancel culture, the tendency of activists to try to shut down opposing voices rather than argue with them and engage them in debate, repeatedly, loudly. There's none of that in Joe Biden. Joe Biden is all about listening to your opponents and trying to meet them halfway and conducting politics through liberal democratic channels. Even Bernie Sanders, with whom I have a lot of disagreements and who I've criticized a lot, he's a radical from the 60s free speech movement tradition. If you look at the early days of the 60s left, when the Berkeley free speech movement was all about just letting people of all stripes express themselves. When some of his supporters were trying to shut down speakers on college campuses, he said, "No, we don't do that. That's not what we're about. We're gonna out debate them." So I recognize that these currents on the left are important, and they have a lot of footholds among activists. They have footholds in the media. There's a lot of voices for those ideas in elite media that didn't used to give those opinions credence in the past. But if you look at, you can't have an authoritarian movement without state power, and you can't have state power without a party. And the political party of the left is almost entirely hostile to illiberalism. I think it would be very hard for them to be any other way, because they have to cater to the views of the public, and the public isn't anywhere near these far left ideas, which are pretty out of touch with where the voters are.
So, Jonathan, could you say something about, same vein, about education, higher education, and the picture that emerges? Is it mainstream media exaggerating for commercial purposes? Is it conservatives cherry picking but the observation that evolves has emerged that many of our institutions of higher education are controlled by or intimidated by left-wing authoritarians.
I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. I think they have allowed in a lot of cases people with an extreme minority to control the terms of discourse and bully people into being quiet when they shouldn't need to be quiet. I think it's an enormous problem in academia. I think that this illiberal left really has gained traction in a lot of spaces that are progressive monocultures. So a lot of elite schools. It's happening in elite private schools too. Well, my children don't go to them, but I've heard from people who do. Progressive activist groups, I think, are having some of these same cultural issues. I wrote last year about what happened to David Shore, which was, I don't think, a story that would have been public if I hadn't heard about it and been able to report it out. This was a socialist, actually, analyst at a Democratic affiliated data firm who shared research by Princeton professor Omer Wasow that violent protests are harmful to Democratic political candidates, violating a taboo on the left against criticizing violent protest and causing him to be labeled as a racist and then fired and then frozen out of his professional network. And then when a handful of people had the courage to complain about their treatment, they were also labeled as racist within this professional network. And you had a much larger number of people who were afraid to say anything. I think that's somewhat of an extreme case, but not a total outlier. I think things like that are happening in elite progressive spaces. Again, I draw a distinction between that and the Democratic Party, but I think these things are happening in a lot of important spaces. And that's why I think it's not only worth, but imperative to speak out against.
And so if I could push you one step further, and you all, we're going to open it up in just a moment to discussion, questions from the gallery, so bear with me. If we take that problem of this phenomenon in higher education in particular, let's say, how does one manage it or contain it or diminish it? It's presumably a medium to long-term process. It's not overnight. It's not about winning the culture wars where there's a peace treaty or there's a moment of surrender. How does one manage or contain or diminish these things that we're concerned about?
That's a very good question. I'm usually very weak on solutions to problems. I'm much better at complaining about them than at finding ways to solve them. We do have a little bit of a precursor though, right? We had an upsurge in political correctness in the late 80s and the early 90s. That was the campus era that I experienced and probably helped shape my thinking quite a bit as well. I was at a campus that probably had this happen much more intensely than anywhere else. What happened? People spoke out against it. It became embarrassing to defend. I think for a lot of liberals, especially, it became embarrassing to be on the side of the censors and against the free speech people. It became embarrassing to be supporting speech codes. So eventually people found more productive ways to use their political activist energies than trying to shut down people with views they disagreed with, which was for a while the main project of the activist left, at least when I was in school. So what happened? There was pushback. It died of old age. It's hard to say. You certainly have pushback again now, but you also have a stronger form of the same disease. So we don't really know how the story is going to turn out.
Jonathan, thank you. That's a great start to this conversation. You all were 21 minutes in. We're going to have a hard stop at 9 p.m. Eastern. You're calling it from different time zones, but you're generous with time. So thank you for that. And let's give you all a chance to participate fully. Matt Henson, I see you. Michelle, you'll help me when I miss a hand or something in chat, but Matt Henson, I think you're ready to join in. I know who you are. Many know who you are, but maybe not everybody. So please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I'm a contributing editor at American Purpose. I've been here from the start. with the magazine from its inception. I was just commenting on what Jonathan was saying about. I do think I myself am a very progressive person, and I've done a lot of fundraising for the Democratic Party in my life, probably more than I should have to stay sane. But I think the distinction needs to be made more clearly in the popular or public mind, that there's a difference between the capital L left, the farther left, and the Democratic Party. I consider myself a very progressive person politically, but I also have a little bit more, I guess, sympathy with mainstream Democratic politics. So I very much agree with what you were just saying about I think people think that the left means everybody from Joe Biden to Bernie Sanders, and they're all PC oppression. And I really think there's a distinction there. And I think it's an important thing, especially for people who do want more people to vote, progressively, to understand that. And it's a very important distinction, because what I hear from people, especially people who aren't super political or who are kind of more centrist or right-wing minded, is I don't like the Republicans because Trump's a creep, but I don't like the left because all they do is nag all day about pronouns. And I think that really hampers the ability to really accomplish important political goals, substantial political goals. So that was just the comment I was going to make. I don't really have a question per se.
That's right. I mean, just a couple.
What do you think can be done? Do you think that's a good thing to focus on, and do you think that can be accomplished?
I do. I totally agree. I think Democrats should be more purposeful and brave about actively denouncing some of these habits that people are associating with their party. As I mentioned, Obama did it all the time. I mean, there were a half dozen times he would go on these long, sort of rants about it. Now, one thing I noticed is that nobody ever wanted to talk about it. People on the left didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want the face of opposition to be political correctness to be a liberal white man, right? They wanted a black man, right? They wanted it to be defined as a position only conservative, angry white guys would hold because they were personally resentful. So Obama's opposition was an inconvenient fact that they really didn't want to engage with. And conservatives, from the opposite end, right? They wanted to tar the whole Democratic Party with this. So if the leader of the Democratic Party was announcing it, that was a fact they didn't want to acknowledge. So they never acknowledged it. And then, in fact, frequently accused Obama of supporting these ideas that he was criticizing routinely. So I agree that it's important, and Democrats should do a better job of denouncing it. But it's hard to get traction with these ideas if no one wants to engage with them. The way ideas get traction is if they get ingested into the zeitgeist. Right? People keep talking about them. People have a reason to bring them up, and no one on either side had a reason to bring it up. So it just went into this void and disappeared every time Obama did it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, we'll get a lot of you in. I want to take in this order for the next round, Avi Tucker, then we'll have a reply, Sally Satella and Bill Galston. Avi, you're first, and Avi, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm a political theorist and philosopher of history. I've published in American Interest, American Purpose, and I had this book. I want to discuss a little bit a new development, which very much connects to what you were talking about, which is a new revisionist history of communism, something that emerged in the last couple of years. It is quite similar to the old neo-Nazi revisionist history of Nazism. There's the argument is, look, most people were neither dissidents nor agents of the KGB. So they experienced communism as a form of everyday, first as industrialization, and then in the 60s, 70s as commercialization and consumerist culture. And when they arrive, histories of communism, there are no show trials because that only affected presumably a very small part of the population. When they look at the evidence, they say, well, what is the evidence that anybody actually knew about the gulags? There is no evidence of that. And is there really any evidence that people didn't like the party? After all, they wrote so many letters praising the party and so on and so forth. Right. And that brings together three groups of people. One is the old leftists who were just very quiet during the 90s when liberalism was ascendant, and they kind of tried to join the liberal mainstream, but they never really had any time or faith in that. And now they can, take off their clothes and show their real faces. then in former communist countries, you have the old children of the nomenclatura. That is the people whose parents really had a good time in the 70s and 80s. And these people, unlike the first generation of communists, took care of their children. And now they went to some elite American British universities. And now they go back to the old gospel, our parents were great. And the third group is the unemployed graduate students who think that if there was communism, they would have a job. And they are right. If there was a communism, they would have a job, only that they would not get an education to begin with, and the job would be in a factory. They don't think that, under communism, only tiny fraction of the population got higher education, and tiny fraction of that got any education in the humanities and social sciences. So it's more of a comment, but let's hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, you can speak with much more authority on the political development in the post-communist states. I only, I'll read the newspapers, but I don't have any serious expertise on the internal politics of post-communist countries. I think it's obviously very different than if there's a revival of communism on the left of the United States. Is obviously very different because we didn't have a communist state in this country. I guess what I was taking more direct aim at was not support for communism, but anti-communism, right? To argue that the correct leftists were the ones who did not criticize communists, who maintained the popular front style of working with their comrades on the left, no enemies to the left throughout, and that the mistake of liberalism was to draw some sharp line on the left against which they would not work.
Jonathan, thank you. Avi, thank you very much. I want to go to Sally Sattel. Sally, good to see you, and thanks for your time, and you have the floor. I saw you in the queue, and have you disappeared, or if I just, there you are. Oh, you're muted. You need to take it off mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
There we
And, okay, nice to meet you, Jonathan.
That's what you do.
Yeah. So I actually am a psychiatrist by background, and I was reading a long and complicated, but I think very important new article in a journal called Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It's an extremely well done psychometric study, and I won't go into the details except to say I'm quite persuaded that one hesitates to say definitive in any kind of study, but that it comes the closest to firmly establishing left-wing authoritarianism as a psychological construct. I mean, certainly we know it exists in the world,
right?
And as I'm sure most people know, the F scale that Adorno had developed, and then the scale that Altemeyer had developed based on the F scale, were all problematic. And this study was an attempt to basically start from scratch and validate the concept, which, let's stipulate, he has done. And his main finding is, and this again might not surprise people, that while left-wing and right-wing authoritarianism are not mirror images, there is significant overlap in terms of attitudes towards hierarchy and hostility towards outgroups and other things, but they do overlap significantly. And he suspects, this is more speculation on his part, that there are about, in this country, sort of for every 3 right-wing authoritarians, there's 1 left-wing authoritarian. But I should say their sample is impressive. It's over 7,000. So just sort of stipulate that. Now I want to ask you, because I'm struggling. I think this paper is fascinating because so much of social psychology as a field has rejected this concept. And really, this paper is really going to challenge them. Like, you can't reject it anymore.
Yeah.
Does it change anything for you? Does a study like that change anything the way you think about it? Or what could be the impact of this outside of the field?
I would really like to read that paper. And by the way, been reading your work since the New Republic days back in the 90s. I think you were writing for it back
Good
when,
old days, huh?
yeah, back when I was there. But Michelle Goldberg, the Times columnist, put it, I thought, in a way that really stuck with me. She said that some of the new race gender activism gives a certain kind of person who wants to bully other people permission to engage in that kind of antisocial behavior. It gives them a permission structure to shame, humiliate, bully. In other words, they've latched onto that political mode when that's just kind of the way they want to operate, and couldn't do it and be seen as a good person until now. It seems
Oh, yeah.
to line up with what you're saying.
Well, this is like symptom, and not to get too psych, this is like Freudian symptom formation. I mean, people have all kinds of identity problems and problems with meaning in their life, and they express it, it just comes out in certain ways. You could be, you could join PETA, you could be a radical feminist, you could
Right.
be, so, but okay, so you'd like to see, so we're ending this on you want to see the paper, because I'm really curious as to how this sort of changes anything, because everyone knows there's been left-wing authoritarian. That's not new, but it's now sort of established again in a kind of in a research domain.
So I want to see the paper, but it seems to confirm what I've observed in a totally non-scientific way. Both reading about the world and observing the world. I just happened to, like, this summer I was reading a biography of Lenin. And one of the interesting things is that everyone around Lenin knew exactly who Lenin was. And, a lot of people were saying, well, you're just going to establish some kind of dictatorship under these ideas. And you basically say, yeah, that's the plan. But a lot of them, they were pretty left-wing. A lot of them as left-wing as Lenin, at least in their economic policy aims, were pretty horrified by that. And I think when you look at left-wing political subcultures, you'll get a fair number of people who aren't authoritarian. They might be afraid to speak out against the authoritarians. But it's usually a tiny minority of authoritarians who are driving the whole train in these subcultures, right? And then you have some people who are afraid to speak out against them. But you'll also have a significant number of people who really object to that. Whereas I feel like in the right-wing authoritarian subculture, it's a much more, maybe this is just the perspective of an outsider, it seems more uniform in its contempt for liberal values. So that 3-to-1 ratio you observed seems to, in other words, it sort of roughly tracks with what I observed. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a problem on the left if the authoritarians can cow the non-authoritarians into going along with what they're doing. But that does seem to track with what I've seen.
Okay, thank you. I'll get your email so I can send you the article.
So, Sally, thank you, and Jonathan, thanks. Sally, is that paper available online? And if so, I wonder if we might post that in chat.
Yeah, I'll give it to you. You'd have to have unless you have a university.
A password. Okay.
PDF, so.
Okay, we'll work that out. Okay, thank you,
out.
Sally. Thank you so much. Bill Galston, welcome. Great to see you, and you have the floor.
Good to see you again, Jonathan.
Thank you.
It's been almost 20 years since you and I debated going to war in Iraq. I'm sure you remember the occasion. Here's the way I want to come at the problem that you've put on the table. You're clearly right to talk about the phenomenon of left-wing authoritarianism and the fact that it is stronger now than it was 10 or 20 and certainly 30 years ago. But I think at this point, the question of whether or not you praise or damn Castro's Cuba is very much a marginal phenomenon. I don't detect substantial portions, even of the American left, who want to go back to old style communism. I mean, there are always some people who will talk about how Castro provided universal health care of a sort, or did a few things that social democrats approve of, even if they don't like the rest of his regime. But the principal driver, if you take the holy trinity of race, gender, and class, the driver of the old left-wing authoritarianism was class. And I don't think that's the dominant portion of left-wing authoritarianism today. I think it's the other two prongs of the trinity. And so I haven't had a chance to read your article, but I'm struck that you've picked up that end of the tool as opposed to the other end, which would seem much more prominent and frankly much more dangerous at this point, because in what you call the monocultures, it's not class that is being taken away from some people and the benefits awarded to others. It's very much the other two pieces, and that's where our people are being pushed around and delegitimated the way Mr. Shore was, and he wasn't alone.
Sure.
So why not focus on the heart of contemporary left-wing authoritarianism? Or maybe you do.
I think I do, and maybe you're just not reading very much of my work. I've written a lot.
Right.
Enormous amount.
That I know.
Maybe anyone else on the left. I wrote a story in 2015 for New York, which I think honestly was the first piece that identified the revival of political correctness as a major force in American life. I mean, obviously, you have people on the right. Rush Limbaugh would say we've always been in this political correct moment, but that's because he's a racist.
Right.
He thinks you should be allowed to be a giant racist all the time. But the liberal critique of left-wing illiberalism would say that this tendency shot up in the late 80s and early 90s, went away, went into remission for decades, and came back. And my article, I think, not to pat myself too much on the back, but I think it got a lot of attention and was ahead of the curve. And I've stayed on that topic. The reason I wrote this one essay about that book and those two op-eds was because I think it historically traced the issue back to the left's internecine struggle over anti-communism versus anti-communism. So the question wasn't so much people saying, we love Cuba, we love their government, we want to replicate that here, but refusing to criticize it out of solidarity with the left. And that is, I think, a strand that's kind of revived this question of, should we draw lines against the left? Should we say there's this illiberal authoritarian left we can't partner with, or should we have a no enemies to the left strategy? So that was the strand of it that interested me and that I wrote about there. But it's not the main source of my criticism of the left.
Fair enough.
Okay, Bill, thank you, John. Thank you. I have Julian, Arvin, Daniel, Ben, and Daniel. We get you all in. I may have to cluster a little bit with a good conversation time races. It's already 8:40 Eastern. We're going to keep you all on time, including our guest of honor. But now, please, all of you going forward, everybody's been succinct and clear. Be succinct and clear going forward. Julian, there you are. Julian, you have the floor. Introduce yourself. Ask your question, please.
Thank you, and good evening. I know some of you, not all of you. I was chief counsel of the House Judiciary Committee for the Democrats and the House Oversight Committee. I was a chief counsel during the Clinton impeachment. Spent a lot of time on cable television, flacking for the Democrats the last 2 decades. Equally disturbed and alarmed by left-wing authoritarianism. I sort of like the two thoughts I want to ask you about is, Jonathan, is this notion of the illiberal left having such a small minority, representing such a small minority of voters, yet they're able to sort of bully Shore the way you described. And it seems to me that a big change occurred in the 2016 election when sort of the Bernie bros figured out how to use social media in this sort of really mob-like, aggressive, authoritarian fashion. And a big part, there's sort of a lot of navel gazing about how bad the authoritarian left is, but it feels sort of like the terrorists, to use a current reference, it's sort of the terrorists are winning the war here, mostly because they have gained such outsized influence in social media, where they've sort of perfected the game of sanctimony and shame and contempt. Yeah. And until sort of those of us on the liberal left figure out how to use those same game, how to play the same game. And I think it's particularly the negative emotions of sanctimony and shame and contempt. Sort of until we figure out how to tactically play that same game and shout them down, this is just going to be a bunch of navel gazing, it feels to me.
Well, I agree with you that social media has been an important force in supercharging this ideological tendency, because it just plays very well to that style. It allows, like you say, mobbing and shaming and the kind of tactics that are pretty naturally suited to that kind of illiberal politics. But I guess maybe to reiterate or draw out a point I was trying to make earlier, I think there is a stopping point for this phenomenon, and the stopping point is the voters. If you're a Democrat, you want to win elected office, you need voters. You can't shame and humiliate and harass and mob people into voting for you. Right? If you want to get actual political power using that, you need violence. A minority can violently seize power using authoritarian, but non-violently, if you try that, they'll just vote against you. It's not going to work. So I do think, maybe I'm too sanguine, but I do think that's the stopping point that's going to halt the progression of this ideology into the Democratic Party.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Jonathan. So you all, this is the point where you start hating on me, because we're really, 8:43, here goes. Arvin, please be brief. And then I'm going to take 2 pairs of questions and see where we are. I don't want to rush it. I want, Jonathan, you to have time, but I want to keep people on time. So Arvin, you have the floor.
Hey, thanks. It's a great honor to have the chance to ask you a question, John. I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. I actually have a piece coming out at American Purpose on kind of rebuilding the Republican Party, and I actually cite you in my essay. Wanted to ask you about liberal intellectuals, condemning intellectuals, commentators, etc., condemning kind of the hard authoritarian left. I'll give you a couple examples of what concerns me, right? You look, for example, September 29th debate, Biden doesn't condemn Antifa, Trump doesn't condemn the Proud Boys, shows how far we've fallen as a country. And right-wing, responsible right-wing media, obviously not all right-wing media, but responsible right-wing media, like National Review, Journal, we're like, this is horrible. They both should be condemned. But I was watching ABC, which is like a nonpartisan network, and the left-wing media didn't sort of notice, hey, it's bad that Biden didn't condemn Antifa during September 29th debate. When I think about election integrity, right? What Trump did after the election was horrific, was awful. And yet you saw like a lot of prominent conservative commentators, condemn that. Not all of them, of course, unfortunately. But if I think about 2016, 66% of Democrats felt the voting, Russia had rigged the voting machines. The person who had put forth that idea was Neera Kundin, who was then nominated to the Biden administration. You didn't see like a lot of progressive commentators say, hey, look what happened in January 6th. We can't be, there was not that this criticism besides, people who no longer work in the mainstream media like Greenwald, et cetera. And the last example I give you is comparing Maxine Waters and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Like I said, you see a lot of people condemning Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right. I condemn her in my essay. Maxine Waters not as much. And I'm using Maxine Waters specifically. I'm not using Pramila Jayapal. I'm not saying people who are progressive, but both Greene and Waters seem to think violence is kind of a legitimate tool of of politics. And I want to ask you, as the one guy who's always condemned the hard left, and you've gotten a lot of hate for that. And then really quickly too, you talked a lot about asymmetric polarization, and I think in 2012 when you had a very libertarian GOP and
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. Forgive my rudeness.
There's enough for me to latch onto there.
Bring it to a close.
Yeah, so I won't go into detail. I'll just ask really quickly. Idea of asymmetric polarization that you talked about in 2012, seem to have relevance, but it seems now the Democratic Party is that may no longer be accurate given a lot of issues that I don't have time to get into. So it seems that framework was great in 2012, and maybe you can't necessarily say that now.
Yeah, I appreciate your point, but I don't agree with it. So let me start off with the first one, the Proud Boys Antifa parallel. The difference is that Proud Boys is a pro-Trump organization, and Antifa is not a pro-Biden organization. Antifa's march after the election was chanting fuck Joe Biden, and they marched to the Democratic Party headquarters in their town and smashed it up. So I just don't, whereas Proud Boys is a paramilitary arm of Trump's political movement. I don't know what near tandem quote you're talking about. I know that there are vulnerabilities in the election system that a lot of people in that field were concerned about. I don't believe Neera ever said the Russians changed the vote totals to make Trump president. But the broader context is that Trump announced months before the election that he was not going to accept a defeat. It was known. He was casting doubt on the results. He was never going to accept the election. This was a well-signaled effort that he started before the election and never gave up, continued after the election, and absolutely nothing like that happened in the Democratic Party.
So,
fair.
gentlemen, thank you.
Fair.
I'm going to pair now, taking Daniel, that is Daniel Goodman, Ben Walter, and then we're going to close out with Daniel from a colleague from Hewlett and Ron Radosh. But Daniel Goodman, you have the floor, and please be succinct. Daniel, I see your image. Are you still with us? There you are.
Here I am. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Great to meet you. I used to be a writer with the Weekly Standard and now with the Washington Examiner. I'm a scholar as well, but I don't have time to give my full bio, just the question. So my question is for those of us who are very concerned with this rise in the illiberal left-wing authoritarianism that we've been discussing, others have been observing. And for those of us who would like to see a return to classical liberalism, what hope is there, do you see, for that without having to resort to an alliance with the enemies of the liberal leftism on the right, the Trumpists and white nationalists and the others? Do you think there is hope for some kind of alliance between classical liberals, reasonable, rational, conservatives, centrists, and these kinds of groups to come together and overcome this?
So Daniel, thank you for that. Jonathan, hold for 1 minute while we hear from Ben Walter. Are you still there? I don't see Ben. You'll rejoin in a moment if you wish. Then let's go over to our colleague Daniel from Hewlett.
Hi, thanks, Jeff, and thank you, Jonathan, both for your remarks today and the way you kind of live this out and checking the excesses of your side of the spectrum. A question for you about the role of foundations and philanthropy in all of this. I think there's a view, Matt Iglesias and others are sharing that they see a lot of the foundation funding driving a lot of this impractical and quite doctrinaire illiberalism on the left. Do you share that hypothesis? Are there patterns or shifts that in philanthropy that you think have brought about this current wave, and any ideas about, if there is, how to check it?
Stay tuned.
Good.
Stay tuned. I'm looking at that. So we'll see what I come up with. That's a very good question, and so that's exactly what I'm looking at.
Well, that's intriguing and promising. And so, Daniel, thank you for posing the question. And then Daniel Goodman, who there you are. Your question was posed, Jonathan. Do you have a comment on that, on alliances? And...
By the way, I would urge I didn't get your name, but if you have any insight into that, maybe you can get in touch with me through the editors, because I'm looking to find people who have access to that world and want to talk about it. So maybe we should have a discussion.
Yeah, we'd be glad to.
Great.
I'll follow up.
Terrific. Jonathan, did you want to reply to Daniel Goodman's question?
I realized something, maybe that this is responsive to that question and some other questions people have raised. So let me preface this by saying that I feel like persuading people to change their mind is very, very hard in general, that usually people don't change their minds. They just they just die and are replaced by people who have different ideas, and that's how people's minds get changed. Or maybe I'm just unusually bad, but generally I've not found people change their minds on things very often, or I'm not able to change their minds, except on this. I've had more people come to me and say, when you first started writing about this PC thing on the left, I mocked you. I didn't think it was real, or maybe it was just happening on campuses. I dismissed it. And now I see that you're right. I'm coming around your point of view. They mostly say this in private. Some of them are saying it in public too. But I actually think that people are waking up to it and coming around. So I think there's real positive movement. I think we should be encouraged that the critics of this movement are making progress. If not winning the argument, we're making headway in the argument.
Jonathan, thank you. Thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to you, Ron. You have the floor. Ron Radosh.
Yes, thanks. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Ron.
Great to see you, finally. I come from the perspective, I guess, of the tip end of the old left. And as we remember, the analogy you made in your article and you made today between the old opposition to the anti-communist left by other leftists. The argument they then used, Lillian Hellman was, of course, a quintessential example of this, is that if you criticize anyone of the left, even if they're wrong, you're aiding the McCarthyites in that age. You are as bad as they are. Today, what they say, and here I want to mention that I'm in a discussion group, believe it or not, with a small group, maybe 15 people, of old friends I've known for years who come from the tradition of the older and also the new left. And they are good people. They in themselves are not authoritarian. And the argument I use with them is every time you people don't criticize the cancel culture and the woke culture and all these horrors that we read about, you're just giving more ammunition to the people you despise, to the Trumpists, because you ignore them and you are the ones who have to criticize them. And I've said that over and over, but they won't do it. They keep saying that's irrelevant. Look at these horrible people on the far right. Look at the Proud Boys. Look at the Trumpists. We have to keep all our fire on them because this is all irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And of course, you've refuted this already. It's just in the academy, and who cares about what happens in the academy? It's nowhere else. And I say, well, look, it's in publishing. It's at the New York Times. It's a lot of places that are mainstream major institutions, but they won't do it. I have not got one of them to publicly, or even among their friends on the left, make a criticism of the stuff we know that's going on. They just won't do it.
That's right. And I think it's a psychological phenomenon. Maybe we should get Sally Satel to explain it for us more than, because it's so simplistic to say, you could only criticize one side, right? You can only do one thing. Whereas if you think about it for a moment, you obviously can do more than one thing. The line I always get on social media is, you said that these handful of kids on college campuses, it's not just that, but that's how they define the problem, is the biggest problem in the world. And I say, when did I say this is the biggest problem in the world? There can be more than one problem in the world, and I can criticize all the problems in the world. You don't have to just criticize one thing. And everyone understands that intellectually, that there's more than one problem in the world, but the power of this trope is so deep that I like it has to be something. It's not an idea, it's something lower than an idea that people cling to.
Ron, thank you very much. We are in the final, in the home stretch here. Jonathan, I'm going to indulge myself and ask you a question. You have said and written, actually, that you focus nearly entirely on domestic politics. Do you ever feel tempted to write about foreign affairs in a week like this, where there's so much going on and it's not unrelated to what happens here in the United States in our politics, Afghanistan? Are you ever inclined to weigh in on some of these issues?
I'm tempted, but I try not to. I feel like I've developed a pretty good expertise on domestic policy and domestic politics over my career. And I think you need more deep and specialized knowledge to really add a lot of value as a foreign policy analyst. So I try not to do that.
So Jonathan, thank you. My final and my wrap-up question before we adjourn is this. For those of us, and I think this includes everybody on this call, certainly American Purpose, which commits itself to the broad, vital center and pushing back against extremes, right and left. For those of us concerned about loosening ties of mainstream parties, stress tests for institutions, and some of the phenomena that we're talking about tonight, any final thoughts? What keeps you awake at night? We all are trying to prioritize and identify what comes first. If you have any final thoughts about focus, larger concerns, and as I say, what keeps you awake at night?
What keeps me awake at night is that I think the Republican Party is evolving into an authoritarian political formation. I think this evolution has gone on for decades. It basically can be traced to the conservative movement's takeover of the Republican Party and its ability to completely define the boundaries of its intellectual ecosystem. And it contained kernels of anti-democratic belief from the beginning, and those kernels have become dominant. And Trump is only the grossest and most obvious manifestation of that trend. So when I'm calm, when I'm optimistic about the ability to contain the left, I don't use that as an excuse not to criticize it. If people won't criticize it, then it won't be contained. So that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why it has to be done. But I think it can be done. It is being done. I think it'll work. I think the Republican Party is so far gone. There's no recovery. I think it's becoming an authoritarian party. I don't think there's any way out except to get to a point where the Republicans can't gain national power anymore, and we're pretty far from that point. So that's what really scares me. I feel like at some point a more competent Republican leader than Trump will gain control of government and will go down the path of Orban's Hungary or Putin's Russia. That's what keeps me up at night.
Jonathan, thank you. That is a wonderful and provocative way, the last word for this conversation, and perhaps the first word for the next conversation. To all of you, thank you across time zones. Our colleague Hiro from Tokyo, God bless you for being with us top of the morning Friday in Japan. Everybody's valuable time on the East Coast in the evening. Thank you, thank you. It's that moment where if your camera's off and you're inclined, switch it on just to say hello and greet everybody. Nice to see you all. Jonathan, you've had a busy day riding up a storm. I hope you can have a meal or drink something nice now. Great to see you. Great conversation. Jonathan Chait, thank you very much.
Enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.